What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about all of the core rulebook changes going from 8th edition 40k over to 9th. Obviously, a lot of rules got reworked and a ton of rules got added. I'm going to be talking less about the brand new mechanics that have been added in 9th edition and more about rules verbiage and some specifics that have been edited to move to 9th edition, but I will also make mention of some rules that didn't change, but that everyone in 8th edition just misplayed horrifically, and that I think we do need to have a very serious discussion about. With that said, let's get into these rules changes and talk about some 9th edition. So here we are in the Warhammer 40k rulebook. Obviously, you can get this PDF for free off of Warhammer Community. Go ahead and check that out to read through these rules yourself. First up, we'll be talking about unit coherency. Unit coherency has obviously gotten a big overhaul in 9th edition and has moved from measuring 6 inches vertically, as it did in 8th, to 5 inches vertically. This is to template it basically the same that a lot of other measurements now use, which is that 5-inch verticality to measure for multi-level terrain. Obviously, besides that, the biggest change to coherency is that units of 6 or more models must have all of their models within coherency range at 2 inches and 5 inches vertically of at least 2 other models in the unit in order for coherency to be met. Engagement range has also been more clearly defined on this page. In 8th edition, it wasn't even really defined, and units just couldn't be within 1 inch of each other, but it has been defined very clearly in 9th edition, where it is the zone 1 inch horizontally and 5 inches vertically from a model. That's the range at which you engage enemy units in melee, and without charging, enemy units can't pass into that range, outside of a couple key instances like heroic interventions and pile-ins. So some weird situations can arise from the new engagement range rules. For example, my opponent has put on a multi-level piece of terrain some models up on the top level. Because their engagement range is measured 5 inches vertically, and they're only about 3 inches from the top of the building, from the first level here, none of my models can get within an inch of this second floor, because they have to be more than 1 inch off horizontally and 5 inches off vertically. So they could only move basically up to here without entering the engagement range of the Hive Guard that are in this building. And similarly, none of them can get up onto the second floor, I think, for the most part. Now, this isn't that big of a deal because you do just charge, and when you charge, obviously you can enter that engagement range and you can just go underneath the second floor and then fight upwards 5 inches. Now, some weirdness happens when you put something like an aircraft on the second floor of a building. Now, the aircraft's base can be moved through and its engagement range can be moved through, but you still cannot end a movement within engagement range of it, which means that if your opponent puts something like this sort of uninteractable on the second floor of a building, none of your models can go here basically ever. Until that thing moves away, because they won't be able to charge it because it's an aircraft, and they won't be able to move into the bottom floor because its engagement range extends down 5 inches. It also, interestingly, makes charges easier when you're targeting something inside a building. In some situations, you can have a model that is brought in via deep strike. So, for example, if my Hive Guard were brought in via deep strike with a Tyrannicide or with a strategic reserve rule, or just with a Lictor now, they could just dump up into the second floor of this building and be 9 inches away from an enemy model like this Hormigant. You measure the 9 inches between the bases, so it will be this distance at an angle. However, if that Hormigant went to go charge the Hive Guard, it would only have to move 2 within an inch of the vertical cylinder that's around them. Basically, this cylinder, and if we go to a top-down view, is where you'd actually have to make it with a charge to get into range of that model. So, for example, if this Hive Guard was positioned here, it would have to be placed 9 inches away from the Hormigant. So 9 inches looks like about that. But in order to make a charge, the Hormigant only needs to move here, which is only about 7 inches. That would be a 7-inch charge to actually get into range of that model. Now, obviously, it doesn't quite work the other way around because the Hive Guard would have to move down vertically and then out, which is an even longer charge. But attacking someone who drops into the second floor of a building may be a little bit easier. Just some weird corner cases created by these engagement rules, but I do think the engagement rules are an appropriate rule and a positive change to the game because they remove some of the weirdness that occurs when you have multi-level ruins in 40k, which in 8th edition was really bad. Over in measuring distances, the base rules for measuring distances have changed to define measuring to a model's hull, which is now the closest point of any part of that model. So this will include outstretched bits like wings, guns, or antenna, things like that. As long as it's the closest point of the model at all, you can measure to it, as long as it doesn't have a base. If it still has a base, you'll measure to the closest point of a base. But if you are a tank, then your outstretched parts could be used to measure to and from. In addition, we do have some additional rules for how those should be oriented in the movement phase that we'll talk about a little bit later. Down here in dice, regardless of modifiers, dice can never be modified below a 1. This was not the case in 8 that, although I don't think it really mattered. But there are some weird situations, for example, the Storm Shield controversy that's taking the internet by storm right now, where a Storm Shield on a Terminator with its current verbiage that improves your armor save by 1 will make armor saves that are not unmodified ones unfailable because of this rule. We'll see if that actually remains in, and I think that's the only situation in which this rules change matters. Changes made to modifying your characteristics. In 8th edition, for example, you could add to your base characteristic, then multiply that from a weapon like a Power Fist or a Thunderhammer. Now that's been changed to follow basically the PEMDAS rule, so that you'll perform your multiplication before you do your addition. So, for example, if you have a Space Marine captain with Imperium Sword to give him +1 strength on the charge, and a Thunderhammer, the Thunderhammer will multiply his strength first, so it'll become strength 8, and then add +1 from the Imperium Sword, making him strength 9, rather than, for example, in 8th edition, when you would add to his base strength with the Imperium Sword benefit, then multiply that result by 2 for the Thunderhammer benefit. In this case, you will just be capped at strength 9. Not going to make too much of a difference. Most of those modifiers are going to be trying to bring you above that strength 8 threshold, but in some situations it will be pretty relevant, especially trying to get Space Marines up to the strength 10 threshold to wound Centurions on 2s. It's going to be a little bit harder. Obviously, the command phase is an entirely new phase of the game that's been added to give you your +1 CP if you are playing a battle-forged army. There are some other abilities and objectives that score in the command phase, but those are very specific. Not much else going on here. As we move on to the movement phase, I should mention as well, because this will be important, the battlefield has been defined in the rules, and the definition of the battlefield is essentially the horizontal surface on which you're playing, as well as the horizontal surfaces of any terrain features on that. That is important because at the mechanical level, how moves work has been slightly altered. And moving right into that, a bit of a change here, which probably won't affect you in most of your games, but does sort of clean the game up from a mechanical standpoint. Whenever you move a model, you move it across the battlefield in any path, which means that you're going to be moving it along that horizontal surface. There was some question previously as to whether or not you could sort of move into midair and then just back that an illegal move and pop back down. In most of the case that wouldn't matter, but it was essentially how people justified kind of teleporting to upper levels in ruins and things like that, because there was no rule that said that you couldn't move just vertically for no reason. But now that's been codified in the rules. You do have to move in a path along the battlefield, which is that horizontal surface. However, in the moving through terrain rules, it now states that you can move vertically as long as you're moving up terrain in order to climb it. Kind of silly that this rules clarification needed to be implemented, honestly, but I do appreciate that it's in here. Another change in the movement phase is that now when you have movable parts of a model, such as turrets and sponsons, those can be adjusted when the model moves, but not at any other position. So that kind of cleans up the rules a little bit to allow you to measure to those sponsons, and now you can't just go ahead and move those willy-nilly during the shooting phase to get the best measurement possible. And there certainly were some people abusing this in 8th Ed, trying to adjust, especially large Forge World models like Necron Pylons, I think, were the worst. That could really pretty dramatically change their configuration, and people would just move them around all over the place in whatever phase they wanted. But now you have to move to do that, which means also if you have a sponson or something like that you're going to reorient, you do count as moving, even if you have just remained stationary. Most of the time that won't be a big deal because you're probably a vehicle, but in some situations where you want to avoid moving, it may come into play. Now, for the most part, most of the standard moves have changed, but Falling Back has had a couple changes to it. Normally, you can't cast Psychic Powers now when you fall back, which is a change from 8th edition, and now any Titanic unit can fall back and shoot in the same turn. Obviously, we mentioned before, but meshing into the updated movement rules, terrain allows you to move vertical distances up and down it in order to clamber over it. That is how models are going to be traversing between different floors in multi-level ruins, for example, or on top of containers and hills. They will have to measure that vertical distance unless the terrain feature is less than 1 inch, in which the case they can just jump on top of it without penalty. Once you're done moving all of your models, you move to the reinforcements step, which is just the last stage in the movement phase, and it just codifies when any of your reserves or your strategic reserves are going to be placed on the table. Not really a change here, but it does, instead of just using a nebulous end of movement phase trigger for those abilities, you are going to be in that reinforcement step, which I appreciate. Transport's got a couple changes. You cannot embark in a transport that's in an engagement range of an enemy, and in addition, when you disembark, you will be placed completely or wholly within 3 inches of the transport rather than just 3 inches. Back in 8th edition, you could just place 3 inches away, and that would allow you to get the extra measurement from the edge of your base. In this case, that has been removed, and now you have to be able to fit your entire unit completely within that 3-inch bubble. Just like the 8th edition FAQ stated, you weren't able to charge out of transports that were destroyed on that turn. Some people were able to utilize transports that would kill themselves or that would die to Overwatch and then immediately charge with the unit that was inside. You can't do that, but now you also cannot perform a heroic intervention that same turn. Moving over to aircraft. Aircraft obviously got another big redesign in 8th Ed that we'll be talking about right here. A couple things before we get super far into it that I want to mention. These are actually not changes to the rules, but some things that people have been misplaying in 8th Ed that I do feel like I should point out to them. The first off is your minimum move measures from where the point at which you started. It doesn't measure the actual distance that you moved. So if you have something like an Archaeopter that can pivot multiple times during its movement phase. So to illustrate this clarification with minimum movement, let's take something like an Archaeopter Fuselage here. A plane that can pivot 90 degrees during its movement, but that still has a minimum movement of 20 inches. When it makes that pivot, you'd still have to take into account or the distance from its original position when taking into account your minimum move. So for example, if I were going to move this Archaeopter, right, and I would move it 10 inches here and then rotate it 90 and then move it 10 inches this way, it would still, unfortunately, not be 20 inches from its original point. It would be 15 inches, it looks like. You have to essentially sort of pre-measure your movements with these guys in order to make it legal, and move, maybe a little bit longer. So you could go 14, rotate yourself 90 degrees, and then move another 14, and that gets you almost to 20 inches. So you probably have to be actually there to actually make that movement, that illegal movement of 20 inches from the initial position. So just moving 10 and then moving 10 is not going to cut it. You need to actually be 20 inches away from where you started. Kind of weird. It's a little bit of an awkward situation, and it's a little bit easier on TTS to resolve. In real life, you just kind of have to bring a proxy base with you, I guess. I mean, you should be doing that anyway, especially with a flyer. Bring a proxy base with you and try to work out exactly where you're going to be placing your models so that it's at a legal position, but that is something to be aware of. In addition, minimum moves are actually not optional. It's actually an illegal game state if you have a minimum move available to you that you can be completed legally and you don't. That's not a change from 8th edition, but it has been something that people have been getting confused with. So because you can measure distances ahead of time, and this is all open information, if you have a pivot into a move that's perfectly legal, you must take that move. You aren't allowed to purposefully move yourself onto an enemy unit in order to destroy yourself. That's something people have been doing now that Adeptus Mechanicus can automatically blow up their aircraft, and that is unfortunately not legal. If you have to take the minimum movement if it's available to you. Otherwise, if you physically don't have a place to go, if there's literally no place to go where your minimum movement is not impeded, then you will be destroyed, but otherwise, or you'll move off the table per the new strategic reserve rules, but otherwise, you must take any minimum move that is available to you. Aircraft in engagement changed quite a bit. Models can now move within 1 inch of aircraft and over their base. This was the same as in the 8th Ed FAQ. You just can't end overlapping another model or within 1 inch of the enemy. So you can't move within an inch of... you can't end the move within an inch of enemy aircraft, but you can enter that engagement range when you're moving. Aircraft now don't need to fall back at all if they're engaged by other aircraft. This is a big deal because flying units no longer ignore the fallback penalty. Only Titanic units will. So aircraft back in the day would just declare a fallback and it wouldn't do anything to them. But now they just don't need to fall back unless there's an aircraft somehow that can engage them, which seems a little hard to me, but we'll see how it goes. Aircrafts are also ignored now when performing moves for Pile In, Consolidate, and Heroic Intervention. This was a bit of a loophole in 8th edition where you could sometimes get some additional movement using an aircraft to chain off of in a Pile In or Consolidate. In this case, it's not going to count as the closest model for the movement of those Pile Ins, Consolidations, and Interventions, which means you could still potentially move within 1 inch of them. However, if you don't have any other models, sort of behind the aircraft that you can declare that you're moving towards, then you wouldn't be able to do that. A couple notes with this: obviously, if the model can fly, they ignore this restriction. And in addition, there's nothing that says that the aircraft doesn't trigger a heroic intervention. So sometimes you can use this a little bit funkily, and you can still use aircraft that get a little bit too close to get your characters up the table a little bit farther, moving them within 1 inch, and then using that Pile In, Consolidate, just keeping in mind that the aircraft doesn't count as the closest model. So you'll probably be moving closer to enemy units that are sort of sitting in their deployment zone behind the aircraft. Moving over to the Psychic phase, Psychers have to manifest all of their Psychic powers all at once. You can't sort of jump all over the place back and forth during the Psychic phase. In addition, currently, it hasn't been FAQ'd yet, but I think a lot of people are expecting an FAQ to this. The Smite power can be manifested multiple times by a single caster. The rules are fairly explicit on this. You cannot attempt to manifest any Psychic power more than once, period, except for Smite, but I think this may still have been an oversight on the rules designer's part, and we may see a day 1 errata on that. In addition, when a Psyker suffers perils of the warp, the explosion resulting from that is only triggered if the Psyker unit itself was destroyed. So this is basically baking in the Brotherhood of Psykers rule that a lot of Psyker units with multiple models had, where they would only trigger that explosion if the last model in the unit was killed as a result of perils of the warp. This has just been codified in the rules, which I think is very appropriate. And I should mention as well that the perils of the warp damage roll has basically been clarified as that first D3 damage. You don't chain your Psykers exploding if they kill each other with the exploding heads mortal wounds. Over to the shooting phase, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but units that fell back that are Titanic may still shoot. This is a change from 8th edition where you had to have a special rule to do that, where most Titanic units did, but now things like Lords of Skulls are going to be able to fall back and shoot without penalty, which is going to be pretty brutal. A couple things that aren't a change, but again, I feel like I should mention because a lot of people in 8th edition were playing it wrong. First off, when you select a unit to attack you must target all of your ranged weapons, and you can only target eligible targets, obviously, and you can't legally declare that any models in the unit aren't shooting, for example. You would have to block their line of sight or move them out of range or something similar in order to actually limit the amount of attacks you made. This is still the case in 9th edition, but I did feel that it was pretty important to bring up. In addition, another thing that didn't change between the editions, but I think I should mention because a lot of people get it wrong. In order for a unit to be an eligible target, you have to draw both LOS and range to the same model inside the targeted unit. It doesn't say that, so you'd have to be able to basically see somebody who's in range of your weapon and be able to target them. Obviously, the big guns never tire is a brand new rule. I won't talk about that too much, but it does allow you to fire while you're in melee if you're a vehicle or monster. If you have a heavy weapon, you subtract 1 from the hit rolls, and in addition, you can't shoot blast weapons while they're in melee. Lookout Sir is the new character rule. It replaces the old character keyword rule and has a couple restrictions on it. Essentially, it gives you the 8th edition character rule as long as you're within 3 inches of a vehicle or monster, or within 3 inches of any other type of unit that has at least 3 or more models, ignoring other characters, obviously, that are less than 10 wounds. One thing I should note, though, is that if you do meet those conditions and you gain that character role, it now also requires that the character is visible in order to be targeted by attacks, which means that if you're standing within 3 inches of another unit that fulfills these conditions, indirect fire that can't see you cannot target you. So things like Thunderfire Cannons, Basilisks, and Whirlwinds that are standing behind a ruin and that are obscured with their line of sight won't be able to shoot your character, even if it is the closest enemy unit, as long as they can't see them. A couple changes have been made to the weapon types. Heavy weapons now only impose their -1 to hit penalty for moving and shooting on infantry units that hold them. Any other units are exempt from this, especially vehicles and monsters, but do keep in mind that -1 to hit if the vehicle or monster is shooting while in melee. Pistol units have also changed slightly. In 8th edition, you could still fire your pistol if you were engaged by an enemy unit, but you had to fire at the closest unit. This created a couple weird situations, for example, where you would be engaged with multiple units but not able to pick your targets, or have a unit strung out that was still engaged but then could not fire into the unit engaging it. Now the pistol rule just specifies that you must target an enemy unit that is in engagement range with you. And I should clarify as well that that is engagement range of the unit, meaning that if you engage a single model out of a unit equipped with pistols, the entire unit can shoot you, even if there's only one model within 1 inch of you. Blast weapons is a new weapon keyword, sort of nebulous weapon type that's been applied to weapons. Blast weapons obviously make a minimum number of attacks depending on the size of the unit you're targeting. If the unit is between 6 and 10 models, the weapon makes a minimum of 3 attacks. I should mention, because there was a little bit of confusion, that this is a minimum to the number of attacks the weapon makes on a whole, not per the dice that you roll. For example, a situation that comes up pretty often is a Thunderfire cannon shooting 4d3 shots. If it's shooting a unit between 6 and 10 models, this minimum shot rule will not come into play because the minimum on 4d3 is obviously 4. However, if you're shooting at a unit with 11 or more, it will max that out to 12 shots. You also can never make shots with blast weapons while you're in melee, even if you have a pistol or you're in a vehicle or monster. Makes a lot of sense because throwing grenades at your feet usually ends up getting you a bunch of team kills.
Oh my god, you seriously C4'd me, you stupid fuck?
Now I like also that there's a separate section in the rulebook for making attacks. First off, the fast dice rule is just gone. It's just out of the document entirely. So to play rules as written, you have to roll each individual dice one at a time. I imagine that we'll see some FAQs or something to make up for this and allow fast dicing back in the game to allow legal resolution of games in a timely manner. First off, a big change. All hit and wound modifiers are capped at +1 or -1. Now keep in mind that these are still cumulative. So for example, if you are -2 to hit, but have a +1 to hit, you're still going to be -1. So stacking those -2s or +2s is still going to be relevant, and especially with the amount of dense cover coming onto the table now, it is still going to be pretty important to keep those hit modifiers in your list to compensate. I should mention as well that this is only for hit rolls and wound rolls. A lot of people have come up to me with questions about how the modifier cap affects other things. There is no modifier cap for other things. It's only hit rolls and wound rolls. Period. End of story. That's it. Now, in addition to unmodified rolls of 1 to hit or wound automatically failing, which they have back in 8th ed, now unmodified rolls of 6 always wound or hit. There were some situations in which you could make it impossible to hit or wound something using dice modifiers in 8th edition, but now those 6s will always be going through, so that's just a rule in the core rulebook. Very handy. There's been a change to allocating wounds. So after you are successfully wounded and you go to allocate your wounds to take your save, if you have allocated to a model in that unit previously in the phase, you must continue to allocate to them until the end of that phase or they die. You could have some very complicated wound allocation situations, especially in units like Deathwatch veterans that would have multiple different defensive profiles in them, between bikers at toughness 5, Terminators at a 2+ armor save, and Storm Shield veterans at a 3+ invulnerable save. You could, for example, move all of your high AP shots to your invulnerable save, then move all of your low AP shots to your Terminators, try to pass all of those saves so nobody took any wounds. That doesn't matter now. So if you allocate a single hit to the Terminator off of Bolter, the next las cannon shot that's going to go into that unit is going to hit that Terminator, so you do have to be a little bit more careful about how you do that. Some rules have been added to specify how mortal wounds interact with other abilities with half damage, for example. We also have an ignoring wounds clause added in here as well. And with this in mind, I think I'm going to start a movement to try to remove the feel no pain nomenclature from the Warhammer 40k zeitgeist. Because it's probably about 5 editions out of date, and move to this ignoring nomenclature. So I think instead of saying, a Plague Marine has a 5+ feel no pain or a 5+ damage prevention, we say it has a 5+ ignore. It saves a lot of time, and I think makes a lot more sense, especially for new players. So that's how I'm going to be calling it from now on. Over in the charge phase, a couple big changes have been made to charging. For example, when you charge any units within 12 inches of you. However, in order to successfully make that charge, your charge roll has to be enough to move the unit while in coherency into engagement range of all of the targets that they declared. In addition, this is something that I think got glossed over by a lot of people, and I definitely have misplayed in at least one game. You have to end your charge in that position. So you can't declare multiple units in your charge, then go ahead and make your movement to engage one unit as long as you had the distance to engage the second one, then for example pile into the second one to get the optimal position for your models. Now, if you have the distance to move into multiple units that you declared as your charge target, you must do so. So your charge has to end in engagement range of all of your targets. Now, obviously, if you can't end in that engagement range, then you fail the charge. And this is going to make some awkward situations where, for example, a unit is within 12 inches of an enemy, rolls boxcars on their charge, but then, because of terrain or intervening models, the vagaries of base placement, for example, you cannot get within that 1-inch engagement range. You will automatically fail the charge. Whoopsie daisies. Heroic Interventions got an overhaul. You can now trigger them within 5 inches vertically of the target because your engagement range has been extended to 5-inch verticality as well. But Heroic Interventions cannot be triggered while you are engaged. So the weird situation in 8th edition where you could declare a Heroic Intervention, then not move because the movement was optional, then get any benefits you got from heroically intervening, that's gone. Now there are some additional rules for fighting models that heroically intervened in the fight phase, which we'll talk about in a sec. So you will have to be a little bit more careful about where you intervene. Moving on to the fight phase, a bunch of changes were made to which models can fight and who you can target. First off, you can only fight if you're within normal engagement range, so 1 inch horizontally, 5 inches vertically, or within a ½ inch of another model from the unit that is within 1/2 of an enemy unit. This is an enormous change, especially for small-based units. It about cuts in half the amount of models that you are going to be able to get in during the fight phase. It is also going to be a little odd and confusing just to resolve, because some of your models will be measuring that 1/2 inch range in order to extend it out to another model behind them, or use the 1-inch engagement range in order to fight. When you select targets now, you can not only select units that you charged, or just units within 1 inch of you if you didn't charge that turn, but you can also pick to attack units that performed a heroic intervention this turn, meaning that if you charge a unit, a character next to them heroically intervenes into you, you can now just direct all of your attacks into that heroic intervener and go ahead and kill them off for their hubris. When you are selecting units to charge, it is important to note that you start with a player whose turn is not taking place, obviously after all charging units have fought. This means that when you charge into an enemy, during their turn, assuming that neither of your unit was wiped out in the ensuing combat, you will be able to fight first after all of their charges have gone, meaning that countercharging and setting up to take out units that have engaged you is all the more important. Big changes in the morale phase as well. When you're taking a morale test, an unmodified roll of 1 always passes, rather than the situations in 8th edition where you would roll a 1 and still lose most of your unit because of your casualties. In addition, morale tests now, instead of removing casualties based on the actual leadership test that you made, will remove a single model, then force a second test called a combat attrition test. Combat attrition test basically rolls 1 dice for each remaining model in the unit. On a 1, they run away, or a 2 if they are below half strength, since you subtract an additional 1 from the roll. At the end of the morale phase, you're now taking a unit coherency check based on those new unit coherency rolls that we talked about at the very beginning of the video. Any models that are found not to be in coherency are removed and counted as destroyed, but they do not count for morale tests that turn. Now, moving over from the PDF document that you can find on Warhammer Community, we're going to be covering a couple additional rules found in the Battleforged Army and Stratagem section that isn't in the core rules that GW has released so far, so we're going to our super legit spoilers for these ones. First off, in the Battleforged Army rules, obviously, Battleforged Armies, as we covered before, give you 1 CP per round in the command phase. In addition, you have a new cap of 1 CP that can be gained or refunded during your turn. This is in addition to the 1 CP that you'll get every command phase, so you could potentially be getting 2 CP back, but there are stratagems, for example, that will regenerate more than 1 CP. These now basically have no effect. They're going to be refunding a cap of 1 CP, period, regardless of the source and regardless of how many CPs that tells you to bring back. A little weird that GW would decide to make this ruling because it invalidates a lot of the existing stratagems in the game, but I imagine that we'll see some FAQs on that upon the actual release of the book. In addition, some changes to the faction rules have come into play, namely that detachments don't need to share a faction keyword beyond their super faction. So, for example, you can now create essentially Chaos Undivided detachments or mixed Imperium detachments, combining Chaos Demons and Heretic Astartes, or Space Marines and Astra Militarum, for example. This is a pretty big change, and I wonder if we're going to see it FAQ'd because I think it created some issues in 8th edition, especially with the power level of super factions that could bring basically whatever they wanted into a single detachment. You'd lose a lot of special abilities like chapter tactics and regiment doctrines, things like that, but in some cases that is worth the cost. Obviously, another big change is that the way CP is generated has been totally overhauled. You now start with 12 CP, and each detachment costs you CP rather than generating it, so it might be the case that those faction keywords may not matter quite as much because you are trying to limit the amount of detachments that you're squeezing into your army, but if you're trying to unlock some special abilities from key units, it may still be worth worth it. Depending on the game size, Strike Force probably being the most common, we also have a detachment cap baked into the rules. Dedicated transports are now only unlocked by infantry units rather than being unlocked by any other unit in the detachment. Obviously, all of the detachments themselves have changed quite a bit and have gotten a big overhaul. I'm not going to cover all of those changes in this video, but I do recommend that you go check out the spoilers yourself and take a look-see at the new detachment rules because they are very interesting and to completely change how army construction is going to work in 9th edition. Now, lastly in the video, we'll cover a couple key changes to stratagems. Obviously, terrain rules in 9th edition got an enormous overhaul, and it's too much to just talk about in a single video, not to mention the fact that most of the terrain rules are brand new and not really a change to 8th edition, so I'm going to leave them out of this video, but I'm sure we'll talk about them again in the future. You can go check out the terrain discussion video that is up on the channel right now if you want to just hear my opinions on those terrain rules. I do think that they are very cool. One new terrain rule that I will cover is the dense cover rule, which I think a couple of people got wrong, including myself in a couple of my games. Obviously, dense cover, if you can draw lines to the target's unit's bases from the attacking unit's base that crosses over the area of the dense cover, or if they're just within the dense cover and you are not, that will impose a -1 to hit penalty on you. However, this doesn't actually count as cover itself. So units that ignore cover, for example, Imperial Fist, Space Marines, or Hive Guard, in my case, will not ignore this -1 to hit roll penalty. And adding dense cover, the dense cover keyword to your tables, I think is going to go a long way in reducing the effectiveness of indirect fire, since most of the time they're going to be drawing that line of sight across these dense cover areas. Now let's move over to the stratagems. A couple new stratagems have been added that obviously you can read for yourself. They are brand new, including Cut Them Down, Desperate Breakout, Emergency Disembarkation, Fire Overwatch, which just allows you to fire Overwatch as you used to be able to do all the time in 8th edition. However, some existing 8th edition stratagems have been totally changed. The first one being Command Reroll, moved from being able to reroll any 1 dice, which included things like special ability rules like litanies or respawn rolls for Gilliman or Celestine, to being able to reroll specifically 1 wound roll, damage roll, save, advanced charge, psychic test, or deny the witch test. Now remember, if you're rolling something like a psychic test or deny the witch test, you will reroll all of the dice for that test. So if you roll a 6 and a 1 on a charge, you don't get to keep the 6 and reroll the 1. You must reroll both of the dice, and the same for psychic tests or the deny the witch. However, in other cases like hit rolls, wound rolls, or saving throws, you will pick a single dice, since technically each of those rolls is completed independently. Last but not least, the Insane Bravery stratagem has been changed from automatically passing a single morale test, which the heart of which has not changed, to automatically passing a single morale test and only usable once per battle. This is a big deal because a lot of the missions require you to stay on the objectives for so long that being able to Insane Bravery a single OBSEC model onto an objective is a pretty big benefit. However, in most of the games that I've played so far in 9th edition, I haven't actually used the stratagem, since actually wiping models out with morale is a lot less effective than it was in 8th edition ITC. So unless I had a unit in a very relevant position that wasn't in any more danger that turn, I wasn't really worried about keeping my units alive, especially for 2 CP, which gets pretty costly when you're trying to buff your offensive output. So overall, that's all of the base core rulebook changes from 8th to 9th edition. Hope everybody's having a good time trying out these leaks for 9th edition and is ready to get stuck in as soon as the competitive season for 9th Ed starts, starting on July 25th. It's going to be an exciting time, and I am excited to grind more games and especially see how FAQs and points changes turn out for this edition. Before we wrap up the video, and if you have watched this far, kudos to you. I really appreciate you sticking with it. I want to give a huge thanks to my patrons over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. You too can join to get all sorts of cool benefits like exclusive patron-only videos, early access to any public videos, and early access to T5S2 tournament pods, which will be very important once Season 2 launches right at the launch of 9th edition. Don't forget that we'll also be streaming the T5S2 Season 1 Invitational Tournament starting August 3rd. That'll go for 2 weeks and pit the top 16 players in the T5S2 season against each other for massive prizes. It's going to be one of the coolest events that you will see televised on YouTube. Other than that, thanks for watching, folks. Keep it classy and have happy wargaming.